Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about one of the most sensitive and at the same time most avoided topics within the scientific community, immortality. More specifically, why official science is extremely cautious, and sometimes openly uneasy, when the conversation turns to immortality, continuity of consciousness, or the possibility that something exists beyond the physical body. Let's make an important clarification right away. Official science does not claim that immortality has been proven. Moreover, science in its classical form does not deal with faith, hope, or comfort. Its task is to describe observable reality using testable models. And this is where things become truly interesting. Because the topic of immortality is not so much outside of science as it is at the boundary of what science is currently able to describe. Today we'll try to calmly and honestly examine why this topic provokes tension, discomfort, and resistance within the scientific world. Let's start with the core issue. Modern science historically grew out of a materialist worldview. This means its foundation rests on the assumption that everything that exists has a material nature, or at least can be measured, recorded, and reproduced. This model has been extraordinarily successful. It gave us technology, modern medicine, space exploration, and the digital world. But every model has limits to where it applies. The problem with immortality is that it directly touches the question of consciousness. And consciousness is one of the most complex and least understood phenomena science has ever encountered. We can measure brain activity, register neural impulses, and identify correlations between brain states and subjective experience. But we still cannot explain why inner experience exists at all. Here we encounter the first source of scientific fear, not emotional fear, but methodological fear. Immortality, even as a hypothesis, pushes researchers beyond familiar tools. It cannot be placed under a microscope. It cannot be reliably reproduced in a laboratory. It cannot be tested using standard experimental methods. And anything that does not fit into a verifiable framework is something science tends to postpone or label as outside the scope of scientific inquiry. The second reason is historical. For centuries, the idea of immortality was closely tied to religion, mysticism, and metaphysics. When science emerged as an independent institution, it was crucial for it to separate itself from religious thinking. Science built its identity in contrast to faith. As a result, any discussion of immortality was automatically perceived as a step backward, as a return to pre-scientific thinking even when approached in a philosophical or hypothetical way. The third reason is social and institutional. Modern science is not only a search for truth, it is also a system of grants, publications, careers, reputations, and academic hierarchies. A scientist who openly discusses immortality or continuity of consciousness risks being perceived as unserious, marginal, or unscientific. Even without making definitive claims, merely choosing this topic can become a career obstacle. This is not a conspiracy, it is a natural effect of any large system striving to maintain stability. The fourth reason is the fear of undermining the fundamental worldview. If we allow the possibility of immortality, even in a non-physical or non-traditional sense, it immediately challenges many foundational assumptions. For example, that consciousness is exclusively a product of the brain. That personality is entirely determined by biology. That death represents the absolute end of subjective experience. These implications would affect not only science, but philosophy, ethics, medicine, and even economics. The fifth reason is responsibility. Science is aware that its words carry weight. Any statements about immortality could be interpreted by the public as promises, comfort, or justification for careless attitudes toward life. For this reason, the scientific community prefers extreme caution even when certain data appear unusual or do not fit neatly into existing models. It is important to understand that official science does not so much fear immortality as it does not know how to work with it. It lacks the language, the tools, and the widely accepted theoretical framework needed to properly engage with the topic. Therefore, the safest path is to temporarily place it outside the discussion. However, completely ignoring the issue is becoming increasingly difficult. Research into consciousness, near-death states, altered states of perception, and philosophical debates about subjective experience are repeatedly bringing scientists to a boundary where familiar explanations stop working. And it is precisely at this boundary that cautious interest and sometimes tension begins to emerge. It is crucial to emphasize that discussing immortality in a scientific context does not mean claiming that personality, as we know it, lives forever. The conversation may involve much subtler and more complex ideas: continuity of awareness, the possible fundamental nature of consciousness, or the potential independence of subjective experience from a specific biological form. These questions remain open. Another source of tension is existential. Scientists are human beings too. The topic of immortality affects not only professional work, but personal fears, meanings, and worldviews. Science is accustomed to studying external objects. Immortality, however, inevitably turns attention inward. The history of science shows that many ideas we now consider obvious were once seen as absurd or dangerous. Heliocentrism, evolution, quantum mechanics all faced strong resistance. Not because they were false, but because they disrupted established ways of thinking. In this sense, the topic of immortality may simply be too early for a strict scientific language. In conclusion, we can say this: official science neither rejects immortality outright nor claims to prove it. Instead, it adopts a position of cautious silence. Not out of ill intent, but because it currently lacks sufficient tools and models. But this silence does not mean the question is closed. On the contrary, it may indicate that we are only at the beginning of a long and complex conversation. If you're interested in topics at the boundary of science, philosophy, and human experience, if you want to understand not only answers, but also the limits of modern knowledge, stay with the channel. In future videos, we'll continue exploring where certainty ends and the unknown begins. This is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning.